In my analysis of the biology of Magneton, I pointed out that Magneton used Drillbur to know when to enter Chargestone Cave to evolve into Magneton. In that case, let's talk about Drillbur now. In fact, Drillbur is the childlike form of Excadrill, and the Excadrill is known as the Subterran Pokemon. A Subterran is a machine, typically fictional, which is supposed to essentially be like an excavator that burrows underground, much like a submarine burrows in the water. In theory, a subterranean should be as easy to make as a submarine, right? Well, what's the difference between a liquid and a solid? A liquid is obviously a fluid and it can move around when an object displaces it. But a solid can't do that. But to burrow underground requires a completely new challenge, as rocks can't just easily be displaced like liquids can. However, if you make the rocks molten, then all of a sudden you have liquid rock. Molten literally means liquid, and suddenly it becomes a fluid which can flow around objects. So that's exactly how subterraneans work, and presumably that's also how Excadrill would work. An Excadrill would melt rock, which had a melting temperature of probably 700 degrees or more, and it will form a kind of glassy film around it. Because obviously now the solid has to, or rather the newly formed liquid has to go around the Excadrill, the subterranean, and that forms something like obsidian. When that happens, what you get is a tunnel which is perfectly insulated by this glassy film, this substance, this obsidian-like substance. Now, obviously, Excadrill start off their lives as Drillbur. Drillbur are somewhat weaker Pokemon. Obviously, just being hatched from an egg, they are more like babies. Compare an adult human to a baby human. Obviously, the baby is going to, while still being human, lack a lot of the cognitive abilities of an adult human. And it's just the same way with Drillbur and Excadrill. In this case, Drillbur lacks a lot of the physical capabilities of Excadrill. Again, just like how babies lack the physical capabilities of adults. Specifically, Drillbur can improve the rigidity of their claws and the speed at which they move to eventually become Excadrill. So essentially, Drillbur undergo a training regiment, in effect, for many years to eventually go from being able to travel at 30 miles per hour, which is about the speed of a car in an urban environment, to all the way to 90 kilometers per hour, or 30 miles per hour, 90 miles per hour, in fact. So that should be about 50 kilometers per hour and 150 kilometers per hour. So about 3 times faster. And its claws, which are probably made of a hard substance, such as some kind of keratin-based substance. And I say keratin-based because it surely would be harder, a lot harder in fact, than keratin, and obviously heat resistant as well, to be able to withstand the intense temperature and pressure required to melt rock. and that would eventually reach a composition just by way of certain kinds of cells, specialized cells, producing that chemical that enriches its claws and makes the claws more dense, more temperature resistant, and more metal-like, potentially also metallic, as in actually containing metals, or metal-like in the sense that it behaves like a high-performance alloy, but it's actually organic material. So Excadrill eventually has the same capabilities as a subterrane, and even surpasses the capabilities of a subterrane, because a subterrane can only move at speeds of about like 1 kilometer per hour, but obviously Excadrill can move at 90 miles per hour, 150 kilometers per hour. I think certain subterranes could theoretically exist. For example, there are so-called nuclear-powered subterranes. So you use nuclear fusion to provide the source of the high temperature, high pressure that is required to actually melt rocks. It's not a trivial feat by any means, but the way a subterrane works is essentially the same way Excadrill burrows through rock. There's a drill bit or a drill head, and actually with a subterrane, I believe that it doesn't actually move necessarily, but obviously with Excadrill, with drill burr, they spin. And that spinning motion, that rotary motion, produces a torque, shear forces against the rock, and those forces essentially is the same as when you drill into a wall. What is happening is that you are kind of like slicing the material. You are slicing the material in a spiraling motion, and at the point where you first come into contact with the material, the pressure is very high, so it's quite easy to slice through, to pierce through the material. And then as you go around, you essentially cut through the intermolecular forces that are holding the material together, and that allows you to essentially scoop out the material over time. And each time you're only breaking a small amount of those intermolecular forces, and those forces are generally weak, but when you have a lot of them, for example, compare drilling into a wall versus punching a wall. Punching a wall is obviously much harder because you have to break through so much more intermolecular forces. The pressure is so much lower that stress, that mechanical stress, we see in certain features in the anime that Excadrill burrows out of the ground and doesn't melt the soil, rather it just explodes out of the ground, and that is also possible. What might happen in that case is that the area that Excadrill burrows into displaces the soil, because Excadrill doesn't really seem to burrow that deep, although it can. Excadrill can burrow to about 100 meters, and there is a process called diagenesis, which happens about 100 meters below the surface, and it can cause the formation of rock. So sediment, matter from the sea, from the seafloor, anything that is essentially loose debris, even soil, will form under pressure and under certain chemical and physical conditions a new form of matter, which is sedimentary rock. So that's the transition from not rock to rock. And not rock, so the soil can be displaced, and you don't need high temperatures, because you can just, even if you go outside into your garden, you can literally try this. If you use a shovel, for example, or even just your fingers, you can poke the soil. You can poke that soil and you can see the soil compress. You can, even if the conditions are conducive enough, you can even shovel the soil with your hands. What that's doing is quite literally you're forcing some of the air that was inside the soil, some of the oxygen, some of the air, to escape the soil. So Excadrill literally could do this, could just cause the soil on either side of its body to jam into the soil away from its body, and that will actually cause the soil outside of its body to become more dense, and so it doesn't actually need that such high temperatures if that's what it's doing. And then obviously, because it's spinning, it can more easily do this. It doesn't need to have this high temperatures and high pressures that are required by a subterrane, which, as I alluded to previously, has a fixed drill head that doesn't necessarily spin. So obviously in the ground, iron being one of the most abundant elements in the crust, it's very easy to see how, for example, we see in Pokemon Violet's Pokédex entry that Excadrill's claws are indeed made of steel. They evolved to be made of steel, in fact. And obviously steel has a higher strength than keratin, than natural substances. And it's possible that the more iron that diffused into Excadrill claws, over time, Excadrill obviously would have benefited from that, benefited from the advantage of having more reinforced claws, because they would use less energy to make the same size burrows, for example. Another example, they would be better off when it comes to fighting off potential competition when it's the mating season. So either through a process of natural selection or sexual selection, where females are attracted and reproduce with those males that are fitter in the Darwinian context of fitness, those two processes of evolution would work hand in hand together. So that's Excadrill. Drillbur comes from the egg, obviously, to become Excadrill later in its life, and I think it shouldn't be too outlandish to see how that's possible. And obviously we see how Drillbur is kind of like a keynote species, in the sense that it causes Magneton to know when to enter Chargestone Cave, because Drillbur, being living underground in universe next to Chargestone Cave, it comes up from the surface, and that alerts Magneton that there is that unusual activity happening near in Chargestone Cave, where they're able to evolve into Magnezone. And obviously when the Magneton heard into Chargestone Cave, that also alerted the Joltik, the Garantula, essentially all of the other species in Chargestone Cave to exit the cave. So that's Drillbur and Excadrill. I keep on nearly calling it Excalibur, but obviously we have Baxcalibur, which might even be the next video since I just mentioned that. Thank you for staying tuned, and I look forward to seeing you next time.